Hello, my name's Nigel Deakin and I work for Oracle. I'm here to tell you how you can create applications in GlassFish 3.1 which receive messages from or send messages to WebLogic JMS.
We're going to do this using the GenericJMSRA resource adapter. Now, a resource adapter is a general component in an application server whose purpose is to allow applications to connect in a standard way with an external system such as a database or a JMS provider. Normally when using GlassFish, you're connecting to GlassFish's own JMS provider, message queue, and in that case you're using a built-in resource adapter for that purpose. If you wish to connect to an external JMS provider, you have to use a different resource adapter. Now, provided as part of GlassFish is a resource adapter called GenericJMSRA. The purpose of this resource adapter is to connect to foreign external JMS providers. And in GlassFish 3.1 we've added support for WebLogic JMS. At the moment there's a number of limitations in this, in that there's no XA support and there's limited MDB concurrency. So, what I'm going to show you is an application, an MDB application running in GlassFish, and what this is going to do is this is going to receive messages, like all MDBs, from a queue, but in this case we're going to receive messages from a queue that's in WebLogic. And when the MDB receives the message, what is it going to do? It's going to send a message, and again we're going to send a message to another queue also in WebLogic. So as you can see in the diagram, we've basically got an application which takes messages from one queue and sends it to another. Now, in order to demonstrate the application, we need to send some messages on the queue to start with, and I'm going to run that sender application. If we wanted to, we could have run a receiver application to consume messages from the outbound queue. But to keep this demonstration short, we're just simply going to use WebLogic admin console to monitor messages arriving on the outbound queue. Now let's start by looking at our WebLogic JMS installation. I've got the web browser here connected to the admin console, and I'll just log in. Okay, so we're now logged in, and I'll just navigate down under Services, Messaging, JMS Modules, just to see the JMS resources that I've already configured. Click on the System module, and you'll see I've configured two connection factories, an inbound connection factory and an outbound connection factory, and two queues, the inbound queue and the outbound queue. And these are absolutely standard default connection factories and queues. I'll just open a tab on the inbound queue and a tab on the outbound queue in the browser here. There's the inbound queue. Click on the monitoring tab, and I can use this tab in the browser to monitor the number of messages on the inbound queue. You can see there's 0. And now I'll just look on the monitoring tab for the monitoring view for the outbound queue, and again we'll see there's no messages. So here we are, we've got JMS, WebLogic JMS with two queues, currently empty. Now let's move on and look at the sender application, which I'm going to run in NetBeans. Now this is a very simple, let me just show you the sender very briefly. Okay, so this is all of it. This is not a This is not a GlassFish or WebLogic application. It's just a simple JMS application that connects to the inbound queue using the WebLogic JMS T3 thin client and sends 1,000 messages to it. And that's all. So let's just run that now. WL sender, right mouse, run. Just look at the log here, and it's now sending messages. Just compiling the code, and there we are. It sent 10,000 messages to the inbound queue. Okay, well now we've finished with the sender, but let's quickly look at the WebLogic admin console for the inbound queue. Click refresh, and you'll see this shows 1,000 messages. Okay, now let's deploy our MDB application to receive messages. Okay, back to NetBeans. Now let me just show you the MDB application I'm running. Perhaps the simplest thing for me to do is I'll just open the MDB itself, and you'll see again it's a very simple MDB. That's the entire MDB. The onMessage method receives the message obviously, and when it's received it and extracted the payload, what it does is it looks up the outbound connection, sends the text of the message to the outbound queue, and then closes it. Now the important thing here is we're going to deploy this MDB not in WebLogic but in GlassFish. So let's go back to the GlassFish admin console, and in fact let's go to the GlassFish admin console and just look at what we've got here. Now this is basically a completely empty installation of GlassFish 3.1 at the moment. So the first thing we have to do is we have to deploy the resource adapter. So in GlassFish 3.1 we deploy resource adapters just as if they were applications. So I'm clicking on the Applications tab, click on Deploy, and now choose the file. Now this is the RAR file which I've downloaded from the GenericJMSRA website earlier. This will also be available through the GlassFish 3.1 Update Center when GlassFish 3.1 is released. So the important thing here is to be using GenericRA version 2.1. So let's just upload it and deploy it. And there we are, we've got generic resource adapter now deployed in GlassFish. So let's go back to NetBeans and then deploy our application now. Now as this is a NetBeans application, this will also create the necessary administered objects actually in GlassFish itself. So let's just click Deploy. Now this example will be available for download from the GenericJMSRA website, so you can try it yourself. Okay, so now it's deployed. So let's have a look at the server output, and we can see, yes, that we've got lots of messages successfully forwarded. So let's just have a look at the WebLogic admin console and just refresh it, and we can see the number of messages has fallen to 0. And if we go to the outbound queue and refresh it, we can see that the number of messages has risen to 1,000. So what we've got is 1,000 messages sent to inbound queue, and our MDB running in GlassFish has received them and sent them on, or sent the text on, to the outbound queue. And that's the end of the demonstration. Now finally let's review the configuration that we've had to set up, or indeed that NetBeans has set up for us in this case, in order to allow us to run this application. Let's look at the GlassFish admin console and first look at the resource adapter configuration. This is here, and we can see these are the properties that the resource adapter, the GenericRA resource adapter that we deployed earlier, have to be configured. These are documented in the GenericJMSRA website and in the GlassFish 3.1 documentation. But the important one here really is that we need to tell GenericRA how to connect to the WebLogic JMS JNDI stall, because it needs to look up the administered objects from there. And that's with the JNDI properties property, and you'll see this is a long string which defines, for example, the initial context factory in WebLogic, and if I scroll along a bit further, the URL of the name provider of WebLogic JMS's JNDI store. Let's have a look at the connect to connection pools. These effectively are the connection factories used for the outbound connection. And first thing to point out is that it's configured to use GenericRA rather than the default JMSRA, which is used to connect to message queue. And if you click on additional properties, we'll see that this is the connection factory. Remember that it's got a property called connection factory JNDI name. Now this is used by the resource adapter to connect to the real connection factory, real as you might call it, in WebLogic JMS. So the thing to make clear here is really this connection factory in GlassFish is like a proxy for the real connection factory, which is over in WebLogic JMS. Same happens for the actual outbound queue as well. Again, we just click on this. So this is a queue definition in GlassFish's JNDI, and we see it's configured to use GenericRA, and we see it's got a property called destination JNDI name, which is set to the JNDI name of the real queue over in WebLogic JMS's JNDI store. So you'll notice that we had to configure GlassFish resources for the connection factory we looked at specifically and the outbound queue. We didn't have to do that for the connection factory and queue used by the MDB itself, because those are explicitly defined in the deployment descriptor of the MDB. So let's just have a quick look at that before we finish. So this is back to my NetBeans project, and I'm just going to look at, that's the Sunny JB jar file of the MDB application, and we'll see that This is configured to use GenericRA, and then we specify two activation config properties for the activation spec, which are used by GenericJMSRA, so it knows where to look up where to obtain the connection factory and the destination. And these are defined using the property connection factory JNDI name, which is set to the real connection factory JNDI name over in WebLogic JMS. And similarly for destination JNDI name, this is defining the inbound queue. In this case, that's the real, as it were, inbound queue over in WebLogic JMS. So the point to note here is that we're configuring the activation spec to point directly to the sort of foreign JNDI provider. There's no need for a GlassFish proxy objects in the case of these inbound resources. And finally, let's look at ejbjar.xml, the deployment descriptor, because this is quite important, because you may remember I said earlier that if GenericJMSRA is used to connect to WebLogic JMS, XA transactions are not supported, and that's why it's necessary when defining the MDB to specify the transaction attribute of the MDB to be not supported. That means no XA transaction is performed. So this will make sure that the MDB itself won't receive messages in a transaction. However, there's one final thing we need to make sure we've configured, is that when we send the messages to the outbound queue, that doesn't use a transaction either. And this is defined over in the, if we go back at the admin console and look at the outbound connection factory, which we looked at briefly, but if we just scroll down here, we've noticed that we have to specify the level of transaction support to be local transaction, because by default this will use an XA transaction. So there we have it. We've used GlassFish 3.1 in conjunction with the GenericJMSRA resource adapter to receive messages from a WebLogic JMS queue and to send it, again using the same resource adapter, to a WebLogic JMS queue. There's more information about the generic resource adapter for JMS in the GlassFish 3.1 documentation and also on the GenericJMSRA website. You can also find the source code and NetBeans project of this demonstration there as well. Thank you for listening.